I've known Jack since, I guess, 1979. And Jack Goldstone received his Ph.D. from Harvard and is currently the Hazel Professor of Public Policy at George Mason University. He has had a distinguished career, having published 200 articles and 17 books, including Revolution and Rebellion in the Early Modern World in 1991, Why Europe, the Rise of the West in World History in 2008, Political Demography in 2012, and the International Handbook of Population Policies in 2022. Jack has won fellowships from Stanford's Behavioral Sciences Center, the Australian National University, and the Guggenheim, Carnegie, and MacArthur Foundations. He has been honored with 3 Lifetime Achievement Awards, one from the International Studies Association, 2 from the American Sociological Association, for his research on political demography and historical sociology. He is currently working on his next book, 12 Billion, How Population Change Will Create a New World in the 21st Century and What We Must Do to Secure Our Prosperity, Democracy, and Environment. The title of today's Mackinder Forum presentation is Demographic Change and U.S. National Security. With that, Jack, please begin. Thank you.
Well, thanks to everyone for coming. I prepared a number of slides. I guess a couple people are on the telephone, so I will talk over the slides. For those of you who are quick visual learners and don't need to hear a word I'm saying, take the time to write down questions because I want to leave plenty of time for Q&A. But we're going to start with some good news and some bad news. Christine? Next slide, please. Basically, bad news is the world is a mess. We all know that. Probably not going to get better anytime soon. And part of the reason for that is our incentives are all misaligned. The short-term incentives for government leaders and business leaders is to do things that are beneficial in the short run. Those will often be costly in the long run. But the good news is one of the key findings from political demography is that as societies get older, that is mean age above 35, there's a very strong tendency for people at that age to worry about having more control over their future, and states with populations that age or older are overwhelmingly democracies. Now, there are a few exceptions, of course, Russia, China among them. That's why I think those autocracies probably will not last beyond 15 years. But in the short term, they will make things difficult. So the world is dividing right now. It's becoming more and more clear that the democratic West Plus, as I call it, that is NATO, Israel, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, and South Korea, are facing an authoritarian alliance in Eurasia. Russia and much of the Commonwealth of Independent States, the former Soviet states, Iran, China, and North Korea. These 4 states are all cooperating militarily, sharing strategy, helping each other break Western sanctions, and striving to make the world safe for their version of governance. Now, the democratic West and the authoritarian Eurasia leaves open a large part of the world, Latin America, Africa, Middle East, South Asia, and that area, the rest, if you will, they're watching this competition, and they're open to being won over by whichever coalition they see as stronger or more advantageous for them. Christine, can we skip to the next slide for a second? I drew a line here on the map. It basically shows that Mackinder would be horrified to see that the authoritarian coalition, Russia in the north, Iran in the southwest, China and North Korea in the east, dominate the landmass of Eurasia. And the kind of West Plus, Europe, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, and NATO are on the periphery. Now, Mackinder would say the coalition that controls the heartland is in a dominant position, and those on the periphery should be nervous, and we are. But I think it's not as bad as it seems, because the Russian and Chinese regimes, Iran as well, they're all in demographic decline. So too is Europe and Japan. But the US is an exception, a powerful one, and we'll come back to that later. Christine, could you please go back to the previous slide? Thank you. So, obviously, I argue that population still matters. Some people say, hey, if combat is all going to be conducted by drones and missiles, we don't need manpower. I think the Ukraine war is disproving that. Other people say labor force is all going to be automated. The answer there is yes. It's already the case that most of manufacturing is automated. But manufacturing is only about 15% at most of advanced economies, and we're a long way from figuring out how to automate service. Maybe artificial intelligence will change that, but in the next 10 to 20 years, I think having skilled labor will still be critical to economic growth. Now, given that the world is dividing in this way, the real prizes in international competition include the few regions where population is growing. And these have the potential to provide labor for economic growth, markets for consumption, and, if needed, military manpower. I don't think we're going to go back to the days where Britain was using Indian sepoys to man their army, but it is going to be essential for peacekeeping operations in the Middle East, in Africa, to have sufficient manpower cooperating with the leading countries of the world. All right, next slide. And the one after. All right, demographers trade in elements of population. Total numbers are important, but not the most important thing. Probably the most important characteristic of a population is the age structure. How many people are old and how many people are young? For most of history, you could kind of take it for granted that there would be more young people than old people in any given population. Typically, families had 2, 3, or 4 children. Usually 1 or 2 of them would die, and the older generations would tend to start dying out rapidly after the age of 50. Now, that more or less kept population stable. That is, if you had 4 children and 1 or 2 of them died, you'd end up with a little more than 2 children surviving to adulthood, and not all of them would have children on their own. So for most of history, population was fairly stable. But starting in the 19th century, that youth mortality plummeted so rapidly that when people had 3 or 4 children, most of them survived, and global population started to grow rapidly. Now, that process scared a lot of people. By the mid-20th century, there was worries that a population bomb would leave all of us in some kind of Malthusian excess of people over commodities and food. Well, that turned out to be kind of a over-anxious extrapolation of a short-term trend. Because just around the corner, starting in the 70s and 80s, fertility started to plunge everywhere in the world. People realized that if their kids were going to survive, it was perfectly fine to have fewer children. No need to have more just to deal with the ravages of infant and child mortality. Now, demographers took a while to kind of recognize, oh, people are having fewer children. But once they recognized that, they, for some reason, kind of conventionally decided, well, I guess people will probably settle on having 2 children per family, and that will stabilize everything. But that turned out to be just as mistaken as the idea that people would keep having 3 or 4. It turns out that in a modern society, not even high-income industrial, no, just any modern society that is subject to kind of global culture and global communication, a new family norm has emerged of investing more in fewer kids so that your children not only will survive, but will have the best opportunity to do well economically and pull the family up with them. So across the world, people have started drawing back to having either two or fewer children. A large number of women have chosen not to have children at all, plunging fully into the competitive workplace and saying that their career will be their legacy rather than their children. So rather than stabilizing at around 2 children per household, fertility, that is the number of children that women have over their reproductive years, completed fertility has fallen dramatically well below 2.0, to the point where Japan, the average is 1.3, and in South Korea, at the latest data, the average is less than 1.8 children per woman. Now, these are numbers absolutely unprecedented in human history. We've never seen societies who had the opportunity and the means and the choice to fail to reproduce. So we're heading into kind of uncharted waters in terms of demographics. We're going to have societies with fewer children than we've ever seen in human history. And because there's still a lot of people around like you and me, that is, people who were born 50, 60 years ago when population was growing more strongly, we're going to have old societies. That is, we're going to go through kind of a short-term period of about 40 or 50 years when the high growth cohorts of the mid to late 20th century are still alive, and the very small birth cohorts are sorting things out. So we're going to have population pyramids that are top-heavy, more old people than young people. Now, I put a picture here of Japan. Japan is probably the best known aging country, and that's because Japan started seeing its fertility fall below 2.0 relatively early, back in the 1980s. Now, for those of you on the phone, I'm going to try and describe these pictures. Basically, people point to Japan and say, look, aging's not so bad. Japan is the future, but it looks pretty rosy. Income per capita is still growing. Standard of living is still high. Yes, there's some hollowed out villages in the countryside where they have to put up straw children to reassure people and give them a sense that life is not apocalyptically ending. But for the most part, Japan seems to be doing okay. And that's true, but I like to tell people Japan is enjoying a beautiful sunset before nightfall. Because if we look at Japan's population pyramid, we see that, yes, there are a large number of people. I don't know if you can see my arrow on the screen, but this group here is people who are 70 years and older. And there's a large number of them. In fact, the number of people who are 70 years and older in Japan is already larger than the number who are 14 and younger. So Japan is already top heavy. But there's a good kind of a belly here. That is, there's a population aged 40 to 50 that was born basically from 1970 to 1980, before the real decline in population started. And that cohort has been very productive, is currently in its prime earning years, and is kind of holding up the roof in Japan's economy. So the 40 to 50 year olds are doing well. The youngsters who are not working as much as they should are choosing to live in the basements of their parents, who are still high earners. And so the system goes on. But 20 years from now, there's another picture here, 2043, that group of prime earners is going to be over 65 and moving into retirement themselves. And at that point, Japan is really going to hit a crisis, because there won't be any belly bulge of still productive workers, and the number of young workers entering the labor force here in their early 20s will be only half of the number who are leaving. So Japan is managing to get by with an aging population, but we shouldn't be fooled into thinking they've solved the problem of aging. They've deferred the problem by running up a huge national debt and relying on a mid-career to senior cohort still at work. But 20 years from now, things will be far more difficult. The thing about Japan also is that the sides of this population pyramid are sloping gradually. That is, after this big belly passes through, there's kind of a gradual decline. China's not so lucky. Next slide, please. If we look at the population pyramids for China that I've put here for 2023 and 2043, it looks like a jigsaw puzzle, kind of a scramble of different size pieces laid on top of each other. So what's going on in China? If we look on the left side, China's age population for 2023, we'll see a few things that are very striking. There's a big bulge here of people who are in their 50s, followed by a major contraction. What that is, the contraction, people who were born 40 to 50 years ago, that was in the decade of the 1970s when China was struggling with the great proletarian cultural revolution. Once that was passed and Deng Xiaoping's reforms started to invigorate the economy, we had a spurt of population growth leading to larger cohorts who are now in their 30s. So China has pretty good sized cohorts now in their 30s and in their 50s. And these were the cohorts that contributed to the Chinese economic boom. Now, these cohorts have seen kind of steady economic growth. They believe in the system. They're loyal to the Communist Party for the most part. And that's why China has done so well and continues to do pretty well. The difficulty comes with a population that is today under 30. That population doesn't remember the difficulties of the Cultural Revolution or life under Mao. They've only known growth. And they are a smaller set of cohorts. And the reason is, in the 80s, when the one-child policy was just getting started, there were a lot of kind of generous allowances. Rural farm families were allowed to have 2 or more kids. Ethnic minorities were allowed to have 2 or more kids. And so there wasn't really a rigid one-child policy. It was more kind of 1 to 2, sometimes 2 plus. But by the 1990s, enforcement had increased, partly because many, many more people had moved to the cities, and urban families were expected to conform to the one-child policy, and partly because the bureaucracy that was set up to enforce the one-child policy really got rolling. So from about 1990 onward, China's fertility collapsed rather sharply. You see these really kind of big indents here. There's a little bit of an increase in the last 10 years. That's simply because the large cohort who was now in their 30s, when they had children, it's going to be an echo type relationship where their children's cohort is a little larger than the one that came immediately after. But if you look at the bottom of this pyramid, that's where you see the real contraction. What's happened in China is that, yes, they were successful in bringing fertility down, but they did not expect fertility to collapse. At this point, fertility in China is down to about 1.1, 1.2 children per family. And if that is sustained, as we expect it to be, that will really do damage to China's economic prospects for the future. If we extend just 20 years ahead, and 20 years ahead is easy to project because almost everybody who's going to be alive 20 years from now has already been born. The only people who haven't been born yet are those who will be 20 and under 20 years from now. and those people are not going to be in the labor force anyway. So if we simply want to project what's the labor force 20 years from now, we can pretty exactly map it out. And what we find is there'll be a large number of workers in their 50s, which you say, well, that's a good thing, isn't it? Well, not really, because workers who are in their 50s tend not to be very productive. They tend to have earned higher pay because of seniority, but their productivity is not growing very rapidly. They're not young people fresh out of college with the latest skills. They're not easy to train. So a workforce that is heavily full of people in their 50s and even 60s is generally not a very productive workforce. The number of people entering the younger cohorts will be much smaller than today. And meanwhile, the number of people who are 60 and over will grow rapidly. Now, the population pyramids are a little hard to digest visually, so let's look at the next slide. We can look at different regions in the world according to whether their populations are in decline, stable, or growing. Now, Russia is in decline, China is in decline, and Europe is in decline. All three of these regions have birth rates, fertility rates, well under 2 children per couple, and therefore every generation the number declines. I focused here in the upper line on the age group 15 to 49. Those are your most productive students and workers. That's kind of the driving force of your economy. And you can see for Russia and China, it drops slowly for the next 10 years and then rapidly thereafter. In China, from about 1932 to 33 onward, this 15 to 49 age group will actually decline by 1 to 2% a year. This is unprecedented in history. Nobody has any idea how an economy will continue to move forward with the prime age labor force declining 1% per year. You'd have to have productivity growth of 5% a year just to get GDP growth up to 4% a year. And productivity growth of 5% a year is something we haven't seen for 30 or 40 years, even in China. Right now, productivity growth in most of the rich world, including China, is 1 to 2% a year. So that means China's economic growth will probably come to a halt 10 years from now and even start to decline. The overall decline in this prime workforce by 30 years from now, it'll go down from 670 to 460 million. And again, this is pretty much baked in. There's not much China can do about it. Even if they raise fertility tomorrow, it'll take 25 years for those cohorts to even begin to enter the labor force. So this age group, 15 to 49, is going to decline by about 200 million, by about 30% in the next 30 years. Now, as I say, the decline is going to be gradual for the next 10 years and then accelerate. And I think that has geopolitical consequences that I'll get to in a moment. Russia, similarly, decline is gradual, then it's going to pick up pace and then likely be gradual again. Also, I've shown on the bottom line the population 65 and over. And for China, it's really striking that the 65 and over population starts to grow as fast as the prime labor force declines, to the point where 30 years from now, the number of people in China over 65 will just about be the same as the number of people in prime working age. That's a dilemma that, again, no society has ever faced, and I'm not sure they know how to solve. For the most part, China benefits from seniors not expecting much support. As you probably know, China's social security system is nothing like ours. Rural families get $20, $30 a month to live on. Even the best pensions for the urban salaried state workers, unless they have private pensions, but the public pensions are also piddling, a few $100s a month. So China really expects children to take care of their parents, as has been the norm in China for thousands of years. And while that saves the Chinese government money in the short run, it's a problem in the long run because if children have to take care of their aging parents, they don't want to have at the same time to take care of more children. So the lack of support for seniors is reinforcing the problem of low fertility in China. And indeed, the Chinese government has tried everything it can think of to raise fertility, short of penalizing people by taking away their jobs or homes unless they have 2 or 3 kids. Everything kind of non-coercive that China has tried to raise fertility has failed. I don't know if they will become coercive. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility. But again, even if they raise fertility tomorrow, the number of 65-year-olds going forward and the number of prime workers going forward would not greatly change. So China's in a fix, Russia's in a fix, but Europe is also in a fix. And Europe is also seeing a huge growth in the over 65 population. So these are not pretty pictures. And there's really no way to cope with what's coming down the line 20 or 30 years from now. Next slide. Now, the rest of the world is largely stable. That is to say, a lot of people are saying, hey, don't worry about China's decline. India will step in. India still has a growing population. Well, yes and no. India's population will grow a very little bit between now and the mid-2030s. You can see in the green line in the upper left, those of you who have the screen, that India's prime age workforce is going to grow from about 800 million to 850 million. Not a huge growth, really, and then start to level out and decline. Meanwhile, the over 65 population is starting to grow rapidly now. In fact, I estimate that roughly 3/4 of India's population growth in the next 30 years is going to be people over age 65. That's not a recipe for economic growth. So India, because it has a long way to go in still raising urbanization and productivity, very likely will have a period of good economic growth, but it's simply not going to do what China did for the world economy. The growth in the labor force in India is already petering out. In fact, if you look at a map of India's states, overall, the fertility rate may be around 2.0, but in most states in India, the majority of the states in India, fertility is already well below 2.0. In some of the more advanced states in the southern portion of India, fertility is down to Japanese levels, 1.3, 1.4. It's only in the kind of poorest northeast states, Andhra Pradesh and Bihar, that fertility is significantly over 2 children per household. So again, if the rich parts of your country are having fewer and fewer kids and the poor parts of your country are the only places population is growing, again, not a recipe for economic growth. So India will be okay, assuming they have good macroeconomic policies, but their economy is not going to grow very quickly. And indeed, they're handicapped compared to China by the fact that women's labor participation rate is very low, about 60%, as opposed to 70+% in most other countries. And India's education level is also very low. Now, you could say, well, yes, but the younger people in India are better educated. That's true. But the younger people in India are not the largest part of the population anymore. India no longer has a larger cohort of educated young people entering the labor force every year to replace a smaller cohort of older people. It's actually the reverse. Because India had a big population boom in the 70s and 80s, the largest parts of India's population are those workers in their 40s and 50s who will be in their 60s, who are very poorly educated, and the number of well-educated workers is lower. So you're going to have pockets of economic growth. You're going to have those India Institute of Technology graduates doing great things in a few cities, particularly in the south and west. But much of India's population will be holding it back. Now, I don't mean to say that India won't grow. India is not facing a crisis. I think there'll be a healthy economy, but they're not going to be China scale contributing 20% of global GDP growth. Now, moving along, the USA, our population, our working age population, looks to be pretty stable, but that's largely because of immigration. The data in these tables for all countries assumes that current levels of migration are continued into the future. So the USA's labor force will remain large and stable if immigration continues, but it will decline otherwise. Meanwhile, we do have a growing burden of seniors, people like me. Yeah, I'm there too. The number of 65 plus is going to grow from about 60 million today to about 90 million over the next 30 years. Now, our problem is the reverse of China's. We have made very generous promises for both Social Security and Medicare health support to our seniors. So generous that those systems are going to exhaust their surpluses and go into deficit in less than 10 years. The estimate is about 10 years for Social Security and 9 years for Medicare. But I think even those are generous estimates because they tend to assume fertility will rebound. In the US, fertility is down to 1.7 children per household. And Social Security assumes that that kind of will come back closer to 2.0 over the next 30 years. There's no basis to believe that. So Social Security and Medicare are going to run into trouble fairly soon in the US of A for the simple reason that the number of workers is going to be constant and the number of seniors who expect to get generous care is going to grow by about half over that time. Now, what about the rest of the world? Isn't Latin America young? No, Latin America is not young. While we were sleeping, fertility in Mexico dropped to the same level as that in the US. It's under 2.0. Fertility in Brazil is under 2.0. The large countries of South America are now at below replacement fertility. And if we look at the population projection for Latin America as a whole, the prime workforce is going to be flat for about the next 15 years and then start to decline at a moderate pace. The 65 population is going to grow, however. So Latin America, like the US, will face the problem of how to pay for generous pensions. Southeast Asia looks very much like Latin America. Next slide, please. Thank you, Christine. So where in the world, if anywhere, is population still growing? The answer is two places, the Middle East and Africa. In both regions, we expect population, particularly in the prime working age group, it'll continue to grow for the next 30 years. Now, the Middle East is smaller. That prime workforce is going to grow from 150 to about 200 million. So a growth of 50 million, it's not nothing, especially since the world has little growth elsewhere, but it's not a lot. Meanwhile, the number of over 65 in the Middle East is also growing as life expectancy has expanded. And in fact, the number of people over 65 is growing faster than the number of young people. So the over 65 population will probably more than triple, while the working age population grows only by a third. So Middle East also will have to deal with an aging population, but not to the same degree as Russia, China. They'll still have a situation where the workforce is at least growing positively, and the number over 65 in absolute terms remains much smaller than the workforce, which is good. But for big numbers of population growth, we have to look at Africa. Africa is really the place for young people. The prime age workforce, 15 to 49, That is set to grow from about 650 million to more than double, to over about 1.4 billion in the next 30 years. That is an increase in the number of young, active, working age people of over 800 million. That's a big chunk of people to add to the global labor force. But it turns out that that's pretty much the only place the global labor force is growing. It's flat in Latin America, Southeast Asia, declining in Russia and China, flat in India, flat in North America. So really something like 80 to 90% of the projected growth in the prime age workforce is going to be in Africa. Now that can be good or bad. If those kids find jobs, their contribution to the global economy could be comparable to what China contributed in the last 30 years. And if you say, that's crazy, Africa's poor, how could Africa be what China was? Well, you have to stretch your memory and realize that in 1980, China's total GDP was 1/3 the size of the Netherlands. In 1980, emerging from the great cultural proletarian revolution, China was dirt poor. They had a large population. It was poorer than that of many countries in Africa. What changed is that China got better government and encouraged foreign investment and invested heavily in the education and vocational training of their population. There's no reason that Africa cannot do the same. It is divided into 54 countries, but there's no reason that good governance can't produce better outcomes. There are examples. Rwanda, Ethiopia, Botswana, all have made good progress. What's holding Africa back is the tendency of leaders to engage in short-term corruption to line their pockets and to leave the future blowing in the wind. If we can somehow incentivize African leaders to invest in their people and look toward the future, Africa can be a major engine of the global economy. And frankly, we will need one because there is little elsewhere. Next slide. So let's take a quick look at emerging Africa. What can Africa offer? Today, Africa has 18%, about 1/5 of the prime working age. By 2053, it will have 30% or more, depending on how things roll out in China, Japan, South Korea, and Europe. But at least 1/3 of the global prime labor force will be in Africa, almost twice as large a proportion as today. Next. Now, in comparative terms, so today, the prime labor age group in Africa is a little less than China. It's a little more than India, and about 3 times as large as that of Europe. So Africa, has a lot of workers, but the world is being pushed forward by China, India, Europe, and so on. But 30 years from now, this prime age working group in Africa will be 3 times as large as China's, because China's is shrinking while Africa's is growing. It'll be nearly twice as large as India's, and even larger than China and India put together. So if we look at the world labor force, if Africa's young people are put to work and they contribute as China's and India's labor force are doing today, the world economy will be fine. But in 30 years, if Africa's labor force is not employed, is not productive, then the shrinkage in China and the stagnation in India will leave a huge gap. And this age group will be 7 times as large as Europe's 15 to 49 age group. That, of course, has huge implications for migration, which we'll get to shortly. Now, let's be optimistic. If Africa's GDP per person were to double in the next 30 years, that would make it a little higher than India's GDP per capita today and would require a growth rate of a little over 2% a year. So it's not pie in the sky. It's not unattainable. If Africa's GDP per person 30 years from now reaches India's today, then Africa's GDP as a whole would grow from a little under 3 trillion annually in today's US dollars to about 10 trillion annually, about triple. So that's good. That's a good source of growth for the world economy. But the real bonus would come if Africa got on that track and could continue. If Africa could double its GDP per person again in the next 30 years, which would only take it up to about $6,000 per person in today's terms. Again, not a huge ask, but that would take Africa's total GDP up to 28 trillion per year, about the size of the US today. So Africa can potentially make a huge contribution to the global economy simply by escaping extreme poverty and ensuring that its young, growing population finds work. There's money on the table to be made from improving productivity in Africa. Next slide. The downside is that if the economic growth of Africa is dirty growth, we're all screwed. Because it's one thing to say Africa's economy could grow tenfold, but if its carbon dioxide emissions also grow tenfold, that would mean Africa's carbon dioxide emissions at that point would be equal to all of the carbon emissions from China and the US today. So even if China and the US somehow eliminated carbon from their economy over the next 60 years, it would be completely offset by growth in Africa unless Africa grows green. Hence the importance, even though Africa is a very small emitter today, people say don't worry about Africa. It's critical that Africa get on a green growth trajectory, because if Africa's growth is dirty, we will not be able to meet any of the targets, no matter how well the rest of the world acts. Next slide. Now, let's flip back to the USA today, because we were concerned about US security. All right. So if we look at the US in the world, we are facing serious adversaries in Russia, China, Iran. Our allies, Europe, Japan, South Korea, are facing severe demographic difficulties. All of them have rapidly aging populations and very low fertility. But the USA is the exception. It is the only large and rich nation not facing imminent population decline. Now, that's quite a statement to make, but think about that. Canada and Australia, they're doing fine demographically, and they're rich, but they're not large. You know, they're still small populations, a few dozen million. All of the European states are pretty much facing decline. At best, some of the Scandinavian and French ones are declining slower. Germany and Italy, Spain falling fast. America, 330 million people, not facing imminent decline, very wealthy. We are a superpower. Next. But what that's based on is our history of being a migration superpower. We have exceptional room for immigrants. As you no doubt know, if you've driven anywhere around the United States, most of our country is empty. We have extraordinary room for growth for immigrants, and we have a good history of integrating them as well. Next. And in fact, if we were to embrace immigration, we could grow even faster. I've done some estimates working with a team of economists and demographers, and we've published a paper. The GDP baseline for the United States in 2050 at current levels of immigration, we estimate would be $40 trillion. Now, if we double the level of immigration today, that could be 50 trillion. Now you say, double the level of immigration today? Well, the level of immigration to the United States today is not large. Despite all the panic about what's happening at the southern border, the United States adds about 1 million legal residents per year. That is green cards, citizenship, and so on. Legal immigrants have been about 1 million a year for most of the last 15 years. That is less than 1/3 of 1%. If we simply increase that to 2 million immigrants a year, 2/3 of 1% per year, We could increase annual GDP by 25% by our estimate. On the other hand, we could also reduce our GDP by resisting immigration. If we lowered immigration to half the level of today, 500,000 immigrants per year, that would likely depress annual GDP by 10 to 12% by 2050, would make it much more difficult for Social Security and Medicare to reach their targets. And if Donald Trump has his way and we go to zero net immigration, we might find ourselves with a GDP fully 30% lower. That's how much the economy has depended on immigration to provide young workers. Next slide. I'm sorry, next item. So the best way to shore up Social Security and Medicare is through immigration. There is a pernicious myth out there that immigrants are bad for Social Security and Medicare. It's argued that they somehow mooch off the system and don't work, but the reality is the opposite. Immigrants pay taxes whenever they work. They pay the 6.2%, 1.9% Social Security and Medicare, but most migrants either won't collect Social Security for many years or return to their home country before they do. So for the most part, immigrants, particularly if they are coming here on a work permit, say you have an immigrant who comes here on a 10-year work permit, they make net contributions to supporting Social Security and Medicare and don't take out of the system. So the best way to shore up Social Security and Medicare really is through immigration. Next. Now, one caveat. More immigrants will have to come from Asia and Africa than from Latin America. However, that doesn't require us to do anything different because that is already the case. 2 years ago, which is the latest year for which we have full data, approximately 416,000 of the immigrants came from Latin America and the Caribbean versus about 476,000 from Asia and Africa. So that's about 900,000. There were about another 50,000 that came from Canada, Europe, Australia, and so on. Very, very small number. So the vast bulk of our immigration is indeed from Latin America, Asia, and Africa, and it's already shifted to be primarily from Asia and Africa. Now, I understand that some people are concerned about that. They're concerned about immigration from Latin America. They're even more concerned about immigration from Asia and Africa because they ask, how will such people fit in? What will happen to America? What if we cease to be a white nation, cease to be a Christian nation? That's not likely because most of our immigrants from Africa are Christian. But if we cease to become a white nation, what might happen to our economy? Next slide. Well, we can answer that to some degree by looking at the places where the future has already arrived. Next. California as a state, New York City as a metropolitan area have already been overwhelmed by non-white immigrants. In California, the white non-Hispanic population is just over a third of the total. Hispanic population is already larger than the white non-Hispanic population, and there's significant numbers of Asian, Black, and multiracial as well. So the non-Hispanic whites are about 1 in 3. New York City, smaller place, but New York City is still a large place, 10 million people. There, the white non-Hispanic population is even smaller as a fraction of the total, about 31%, less than a third. Hispanics, about 28%, but a much larger number of Blacks than California. So the African-American population is about a fifth, Asian about a sixth, and Hispanic and white non-Hispanic about a third. In other words, California and New York City are already places where the old majority of non-Hispanic whites have long since ceased to be a majority and are now a third or less of the total population. Now, That has not been catastrophic for those economies. Quite the reverse. California still has a much higher GDP per capita than the average for the United States as a whole, about 20% larger. And New York City has almost double the GDP per capita of the USA as a whole. Now, cause and effect, of course, you can say, well, the reason California and New York City have so many immigrants is because they have booming economies. They attract migrants. Yes, that's true. But the bottom line is having a very large migrant population has not in any way hurt their economies. They are still booming. Next. You might say, well, where are those migrants coming from? Aren't most of them old migrants? Well, actually, in New York City, 36% of the population is foreign born. That is more than 1 in 3 of New York City's population is non-native. Where are they from? The largest groups of non-natives are from the Dominican Republic, China, Jamaica, Guyana, Mexico, Ecuador, Brazil, Haiti, Trinidad and Tobago, Colombia, Russia, and El Salvador. That is, the bulk of the foreign-born population in New York City is not coming from advanced industrial European countries. The bulk of those foreign workers are coming from countries much poorer than the United States. But even though that foreign-born population, which is fully 1/3 of the entire population of the city, even though they have come from poor countries, they're not dragging down the income per capita produced in New York City. In fact, as all of you know who have been to New York City, they're working like hell. Immigrants are the hardest working and the most entrepreneurial elements in our population. More companies are started by immigrants. More high-tech companies are headed by immigrants or the children of immigrants. They make things boom. Next. Even for California statewide, 27% of the population is foreign born. That's about twice the percentage for the United States as a whole. That's right, California, more than 1/4 of the population of California was born outside the United States. About half of them were born in Latin America, 40% in Asia. Again, where are they from? Well, the foreign-born population in California, mostly from Mexico, the Philippines, China, India, Vietnam, again, mostly overwhelmingly from places poorer than the US. And as I mentioned, in the last 10 years, much more of the immigration is from Asia than from Latin America. So it's already shifted. So in a sense, in New York and California, the future is here. Nothing really to be afraid of, at least economically. Immigration seems to work. Next slide. So summing things up, Russia and China are in demographic decline, but that will be mild for the next 10 years and then proceed with a vengeance. So there is a very high danger window for the coming decade of aggression while Russia and China see themselves as still strong. Certainly, Russia and China know they are facing demographic decline. They are doing what they can, both in economic policy and population policy, to offset it, but they also both know that their best chance of being strong compared to other countries is in the next 10 years. And that is when deterrence needs to be really made most effective. Next. India is an interesting case. They have pretty much reached demographic stability. Their growth will not offset China's decline. Only the Middle East and African regions will really show substantial population growth, but that is a problem if they remain chaotic. The challenge of the Middle East and Africa is that large, youthful, and growing populations in those regions create fertile grounds for conflict, extremism, and terror if those economies cannot absorb their youth. We just got a lesson in Gaza of what a large, youthful population can be driven to do in terms of embracing terrorism. We still see wars in Yemen, Sudan, most of the kind of egregious instability in the world is going to be in Africa and the Middle East, because that's where you have the large youthful populations. The ways to counter that are to get people in a situation where they have stable governance, where they have hope for the future, and where they have opportunities to invest in education and work rather than in militarism as a way to get ahead. Next. Now, if education and economic growth in Africa, especially, but also the Middle East, if they can somehow occur, it is a win-win. The more educated and productive the labor force can be in Africa and the Middle East, the more the global economy will grow, the more consumption markets will be open for the producers in Europe, North America, and Asia. There will be a better trained labor force available for migration, and there will be less migration pressure if those populations have opportunities at home. Unfortunately, however, weak growth in the Middle East and Africa, and or dirty economic growth, would be a disaster for the world. And in the meantime, we can expect quite a lot of global competition between Russia, China on the one hand, and Europe and the West on the other, for African states' alliances, whether to gain access to their raw materials, or I expect in the future, even more importantly, access to their young skilled workers. Next. And there's the last thought. Generous immigration, if orderly and well regulated, is the best way for the US and Europe to compete with Russia, China, and continue to grow their economies. Now, let me just have a word on immigration. Most Americans are in favor of immigration, even increasing immigration, if it is legal, orderly, and well regulated. What troubles people and what gives politicians an entry point to fan fears about immigration is the specter of disorder. The idea that the process of immigration is allowing people in without them being vetted or monitored. In fact, 20,000 immigrants who are unknown, unacknowledged, and at loose in our society is much more terrifying than 1 million immigrants who have been processed through legal channels, have their identity registered, and who can be monitored by law enforcement and promptly deported if they commit a crime. Americans are fine with the latter scenario. They are scared of the former. So what's imperative to deal with immigration is not reducing immigration or stopping immigration. What's required is imposing order on a system that has grown disorderly and chaotic. And it's grown disorderly and chaotic for kind of some peculiar reasons. Mainly, the United States has signed up to a legal system granting fairly generous rights of asylum to people who present themselves in the US border. So all you have to do is cross the border, get in, say you're seeking asylum, and you enter a system that doesn't have the capacity to make a prompt decision, but that still guarantees you full benefit of due legal process, which in practice means you get a few years to kind of fade into the countryside and seek your fortune. Well, that's a system that obviously presents a lot of incentive for people to try and cross the border, legally or illegally, any way they can do it, present themselves as seeking asylum, and then take advantage of the backlogs and clogs in the system. There's no need for us to put up with that. If Congress could get together and the Republicans and Democrats, as they did in the Senate bill that was turned back, if they could agree on a few procedures that simply say, to enter the US, you need to go through procedures before presenting yourself at the border. If you enter the country illegally, you do not have automatic right of due process while you stay. Instead, if you enter the country illegally, you're subject to prompt and immediate deportation, where you can apply afterwards for entry, although you go to the back of the line. We could easily disincentivize the process of people just trying to jam themselves across the border. Once we reduce the disorder and chaos at the southern rim, immigration would be more readily accepted, and we can use it as a way to strengthen ourselves for the future and take advantage of the fact that our demographically declining adversaries do not have the immigration opportunities that we have here. All right, I will end there. Thank you for sticking through the whole hour, but happy to stay for questions.